Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes.
Great to be here.
Today we're diving into Roger Chickering's The German Empire, 1871-1918. You shared this one with us, and our mission today is really to unpack the key aspects of this pretty intense period.
Yeah, looking at the forces that shaped the German Empire, right from its unification all the way to its eventual collapse.
Exactly. And we know you're interested in getting this knowledge quickly, but also, thoroughly. So we'll try to provide a clear structure, a good overview of the book's main arguments without making it feel too overwhelming.
And Chickering's approach is interesting. He examines the empire through constant comparison, not just against other nations at the time, but also against Germany's own past, and even looking forward.
Right, comparing it to itself, in a way.
Yeah. And some key themes pop up again and again, things like the influence of these sort of pre-modern elites, even with all the economic changes happening. The difficulties in actually forging a single national identity from all these different regions, the huge social impact of rapid industrialization.
That must have been massive.
Oh, absolutely. Then there's the state struggling with religious movements, socialist movements. The culture camp comes into play there.
You'll definitely get to that.
And also the complexities of nationalism itself, who it included, who it excluded, ethnic tensions too, and this big push for world power status, Weltpolitik.
Which, of course, leads towards the end.
Exactly. Ultimately, the factors leading to World War I and the empire's end. We'll try to follow these themes chronologically, basically how the book lays them out.
Perfect. Okay, so the book kicks off looking at the foundation, right? After the Franco-Prussian War in 71, I think Disraeli said it was a bigger deal than the French Revolution, changed the whole power balance in Europe.
Yeah, he saw it as fundamentally reshaping things, and the immediate building blocks, the constitution of the empire, it essentially grew out of the North German Confederation's constitution.
Okay, so an expansion?
Right. It created a federation of states. And these states, they kept a surprising amount of autonomy. Things like education, religion, even parts of their own military setups.
Interesting. So not fully centralized from day one?
No. And what's really key is that the authority didn't really come from, popular sovereignty, not directly. It was more about agreements between these existing states, these rulers.
But Prussia's role, I mean, that had to be huge, right? Especially the military. The Imperial German Army seems so heavily Prussian.
Oh, absolutely paramount. The Prussian military system, universal conscription, its doctrines, its whole structure that became the model for the entire empire.
And the King of Prussia was in charge.
In wartime, yes, the Prussian king held the ultimate command. So right there, you see this tension, this push for national unity, but at the same time, the clear dominance of one state, Prussia, and its really powerful institutions, especially the army.
And building that shared national feeling, that wasn't automatic either, was it? The book mentions even something like teaching German history in schools was controversial.
Precisely. There was the so-called Russian interpretation, basically, emphasizing Prussia's central role in making Germany.
Ah, the Prussian version of events.
Exactly. And that wasn't swallowed whole everywhere, particularly in the southern German states. They had their own histories, their own loyalties. They often pointed more towards, shared culture, shared language as the basis for unity, not just Prussian military might.
Makes sense. Even the symbols, like the flag and the anthem. The book suggests they were often compromises, reflecting the difficulty in finding something everyone could rally around.
They were often products of compromise, yeah. Although the military victories that led to unification, those played a big part in the early symbolism. You saw lots of monuments to those victories.
Celebrating the wins.
Yes, and often kind of implicitly pointing towards, maybe future conflicts too, especially with France.
But beyond the state pushing these things, the book also talks about this idea of a national milieu, like shared values, especially among the liberal middle class. They initially saw the empire as their big win, right?
For many of them, yes, unification plus the economic liberalization that came with it, that felt like a huge victory. They saw themselves as the national class.
The driving force.
In their view, yeah. The new state was supposed to embody their ideals, individual freedoms, economic opportunity, all within a stable nation. But their vision of a truly dominant liberal parliament, like in Britain, that didn't quite happen, especially with Bismarck still pulling a lot of strings.
Ah, Bismarck. He seems key in these early years. He worked with the liberals initially, but then his priorities shifted, especially when the economy took a downturn in the 1870s. The book calls this the start of high industrialism.
That's a major turning point Chickering highlights. The 1870s slump shifted things, Bismarck moved away from some of the liberals, and this era, high industrialism, it saw just incredibly rapid industrial growth.
Like what kinds of industries?
German companies became absolute giants. Metallurgy, engineering, chemicals, mining, huge sectors. This needed massive investment, huge workforces. You get serious economic concentration.
Gig factories, big companies.
Exactly. And at the same time, major population shifts. There was emigration early on, but then prosperity returned. And Germany actually started attracting immigrants to fill all these industrial jobs.
And religion was still a big factor in society, right? The book talks about Catholics and Protestants being concentrated in different areas.
Yeah.
How did that divide affect things?
Oh, hugely. Religious affiliation was still a really powerful social marker. Even within Protestantism, there were efforts at unity, but divisions remained.
And Catholicism.
Catholicism was grappling with things like papal pronouncements that were pretty critical of modern trends, liberalism, secularism, that sort of thing. This really sets the stage for the culture camp.
Right, the culture struggle. Bismarck trying to limit Catholic influence.
Exactly. In areas like education, marriage, the state trying to assert control over the Catholic Church's influence in public life.
That sounds like a major conflict. How did the culture camp actually end up? And what does it show about the challenge of unifying the nation?
Well, it basically ended in a stalemate. The state passed laws, yes, but the Catholic population resisted fiercely. And what actually happened was it strengthened Catholic identity.
Oh, interesting. Backfired a bit.
In a way, yeah. It led to the growth of all sorts of Catholic associations, social clubs, political groups, you name it. So this state attempt to unify by suppressing a minority identity, it kind of paradoxically made that identity stronger and more organized.
While all this industrial change was happening in the cities, what about the countryside? Was it just static, traditional? The book mentions changes there, too.
Yeah, it's easy to picture rural Germany as unchanging, but it wasn't static at all. Serfdom was on the way out. There were pushes for agricultural modernization, often through local farmer groups, cooperatives.
And it changed there, too.
Definitely. But significant social hierarchies, big inequalities, they absolutely persisted in the countryside. And these pressures, the economic hardships and inequalities, they drove a lot of people off the land.
Towards the cities.
Exactly, towards those booming industrial centers. The book really shows that connection.
And that massive move from rural areas to cities, that must have caused huge social upheaval. The book talks about a working class identity forming.
Absolutely. The cities, especially in places like the Ruhr Valley in the West, they grew so fast. Often faster than housing, sanitation, schools could keep up. Created major social problems.
Overcrowding, poor conditions.
Yeah. And these new ways of working in factories, living in these dense urban areas, it fostered this shared working class experience, a common identity. And that became the fertile ground for social democracy to grow.
So the book traces how this social democratic movement started organizing, developing its ideas. It must have seemed like a big challenge to the established powers.
Oh, definitely. The socialist message, criticizing capitalism, demanding more equality, more democracy, it really resonated with industrial workers.
Gaining ground.
It gained significant traction, and despite some internal arguments early on, it grew into a major political force. So much so that the state tried to crush it with the anti-socialist laws.
Right, banning their organizations, their publications.
Exactly. But even facing that repression, the movement kept evolving. They participated in elections when they could, built really strong organizations, especially trade unions.
So despite the government trying to stop it, social democracy proved pretty resilient. It sounds like this ongoing tension, the establishment versus this rising working class movement.
That's a central theme. It was complex. There was outright conflict, harsh rhetoric, but also gradually some degree of accommodation. Elements of collective bargaining started to emerge.
So not just fighting.
Not just fighting.
Okay.
And by the early 20th century, Germany actually had a relatively advanced social welfare system compared to some other places, though the underlying tensions were definitely still there.
Beyond the big political and economic shifts, the book mentions all these clubs and associations sprouting up, sports clubs, choirs, even consumer groups. What was their role?
These Vereine, as they're called, were incredibly important. They were the fabric of social life for many Germans, spaces for interaction, building identities. Sometimes they crossed religious or class lines, other times they reinforced them.
Interesting. And back to the rural areas for a moment, the book mentions the hardship faced by farm workers often pushed them to the cities. But what about those who stayed? Did they start organizing too?
Yes, absolutely. That eastward migration to industrial areas was huge. But for those who stayed, agricultural interests got more organized. You saw groups forming, sometimes along religious lines, like the Catholic peasant leagues, fighting for their specific needs.
And what about gender roles? Were ideas about men and women changing during this time? The book mentions influences from earlier, like the French Revolution.
Things were definitely shifting. Traditional roles were being challenged, redefined. On one hand, nationalism often reinforced certain ideas, the nation as a family, with specific roles for men and women.
The strong fatherland, the nurturing mother.
Something like that. But on the other hand, industrialization pulled more women into paid work outside the home. And women's activism started to emerge, campaigning for rights, though they faced big hurdles, social norms, religious divides.
It sounds like a period of real flux. Now, the introduction of equal manhood suffrage for Reichstag elections, at least the book calls it a political mass market. How did that change politics?
It fundamentally changed how parties operated. They suddenly had this much larger electorate to appeal to.
Millions of new voters.
Exactly. So parties had to get more organized, build formal structures. They relied heavily on partisan newspapers to get their message out, mobilize supporters. It created new ways of campaigning, engaging people in politics.
And the parties themselves changed over time. Liberals were strong early on, but then others rose.
Yes, the landscape shifted. The liberal parties, which were dominant initially, faced challenges. Conservatives actually regained ground, partly by pushing for protectionist tariffs when agricultural prices fell. That helped them win back rural support.
Protectionism helping the farmers.
And landowners, yes.
Yeah.
Then you had the Center Party, representing Catholic interests. They became a really crucial balancing force in the Reichstag, very skillful at navigating those religious tensions and advocating for their voters.
And of course, the Social Democrats we talked about earlier, growing stronger and stronger.
Steadily gaining votes and seats, becoming a major force that couldn't be ignored despite the hostility from the establishment.
And tying into all this is nationalism. It became incredibly powerful, often linked with militarism, right? The book talks about military values spreading into civilian life. It wasn't just about the army itself.
No, the army had immense prestige. And military values discipline, order, loyalty, hierarchy. They increasingly influenced civic culture, schools, associations, even family life. But Chickering cautions against seeing it as just imposed from the top down.
It resonated with people.
It often resonated with existing civilian values and concerns about order and national strength.
But this strong nationalism, it often worked by defining who was in the nation and who was out, creating divisions, like attitudes towards social democrats or ethnic minorities.
Absolutely. National unity was frequently defined against perceived enemies, both inside and outside Germany. While some historians talk about a more everyday, inclusive, banal nationalism, Chickering really emphasizes how important exclusion was in defining who counted as truly German.
And people organized around this, nationalist groups.
Yes, all sorts of nationalist associations flourish. Groups like the Pan-German League, the Navy League, they often tried to bridge class and religious divides in their appeal for national unity.
And did they have much influence?
They became a significant force. They shaped public opinion, pressured the government to adopt more aggressive nationalist policies, promoting their specific vision of Germanness.
The book also looks closely at ethnic conflicts within the empire. Policies towards Poles in the east, the situation in Alsace-Lorraine after it was annexed from France.
Yeah.
What does this show about the limits of national integration?
Well, the policies aimed at Germanizing the eastern provinces, particularly targeting Polish language and culture, often backfired. They actually tended to strengthen Polish national identity and create lasting resentment.
So, counterproductive.
Largely, yes. Alsace-Lorraine was complex. There was initial resistance to German rule after 1871, definitely. But over time, Chickering notes, a degree of integration did happen. People there participated in German politics, the economy. It shows the varied experiences of different minority groups, not a single story.
And the experience of Jews in the empire is another critical part the book examines. Legally, they were emancipated, equal citizens. But social and political anti-Semitism was still there, even growing.
That's a really important point. Yes, legal emancipation was achieved. Jews saw significant economic and social success in many areas, but discrimination persisted. And anti-Semitic ideologies, which increasingly framed Jewishness in racial or ethnic terms, not just religious, gained traction in various parts of society.
So legal equality didn't mean social acceptance.
Not by a long shot. And Zionism also emerged during this period, partly as a response to these ongoing challenges and the rise of this new, often racialized anti-Semitism.
Towards the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, the book talks about racial science and eugenics becoming more prominent. How did those ideas connect to nationalism and social issues?
These ideas, often based on distorted interpretations of Darwin, tried to give biological, scientific explanations for social problems, for differences between groups. They had a significant impact on how various groups, ethnic minorities, the poor, people with disabilities were viewed. They fed into these exclusionary ideas of who truly belonged to the healthy national body.
A darker undercurrent. Then comes Wilhelm II, and this push for world power status, Weltpolitik. That seems to mark a shift towards a more assertive foreign policy.
Definitely. The ambition to be a global power, like Britain, to get Germany's place in the sun became a major driver. Figures like Chancellor Bülow really articulated this. And the massive expansion of the German Navy under Admiral Tirpitz was central to this, building a huge fleet to challenge Britain. This, predictably, ignited a naval arms race and seriously damaged relations, especially with the British.
Domestically, during this later period, did the central government get stronger?
Yes. The book notes a further consolidation of power in federal institutions. National agencies grew. Big national issues like tariffs, factor laws became more central. The Reichstag played a role, but the executive branch, the chancellor, and the Kaiser's government also gained significant power.
There's mention of the 1907 election, the Hottentot election. That sounds significant. What happened there?
It was a key moment. The government very successfully used colonial issues, specifically a revolt in German Southwest Africa, and whipped up nationalist sentiment to rally support against the enemies of the nation.
Meaning the Social Democrats and the Center Party.
Primarily, yes. They painted them as unpatriotic, and it worked, resulting in a big win for the pro-government parties. It showed how nationalism could be mobilized for domestic political gain.
But the book points out that even with this nationalist win, underlying problems didn't go away, like the voting system in Prussia itself.
Exactly. That notorious three-class voting system in Prussia. It heavily weighted votes based on taxes paid, essentially ensuring the wealthy elite dominated the Prussian parliament. This remained a huge source of anger and demands for reform. It symbolized the limits of democracy in Germany, the continued power of the old aristocracy.
And farmers were still unhappy. Agrarian discontent continued.
Yes, farmers faced ongoing economic pressures. Many felt the established agricultural groups weren't representing them well. So you saw more radical protest movements emerge, sometimes cutting across religious lines. Groups like the Agrarian League, which could also be quite nationalistic and sometimes anti-Semitic.
As the 20th century gets going, globalization starts having a big impact, right?
Yeah.
Economically, but also how Germany saw itself.
Absolutely. Germany was a huge player in global trade, had a massive merchant fleet. But this interconnectedness also brought new anxieties about competition, about being vulnerable to global markets. It fed into a sense of geopolitical insecurity.
And Germans were looking outwards, studying other countries,
Right.
like the U.S.
Yes, Chickering highlights how German academics, business leaders, policymakers were closely studying other nations, especially the United States, trying to understand American industrial power, agricultural efficiency, partly to learn, partly to figure out how to compete.
But this looking outwards, did it also make them feel more threatened, pushing nationalism and foreign policy in a riskier direction?
It seems so. The feeling that Germany was a revisionist power, that it hadn't gotten its fair share of colonies or global influence, fueled this desire for expansion and a growing focus on potential enemies. It contributed to a more aggressive international stance.
And the relationship with Britain just kept getting worse, mainly because of the Navy.
That was a huge factor. The Anglo-German antagonism really deepened after the 1890s, building a massive battle fleet right in the North Sea. Britain saw that as a direct challenge to its survival, its naval supremacy. It led to this really dangerous cycle of suspicion and the arms race.
The book also goes into military thinking, the focus on offense, the Schlieffen Plan. What is the core idea there?
The German military leadership was heavily focused on offensive strategies, based on what they thought they'd learned from the unification wars. The Schlieffen Plan was designed for a two-front war against France and Russia.
The nightmare scenario.
Exactly. The plan was to knock out France very quickly with a massive attack through Belgium, assuming Russia would be slow to mobilize. Then they could turn east. It was incredibly ambitious, complex, and full of risks, but it became the bedrock of their war planning.
Were there any voices in the military saying, hang on, maybe warfare is changing?
There were some, yes. Some thinkers recognized that with bigger armies, better firepower, repeating those quick 19th century victories might be impossible. They argued for more flexibility, emphasizing firepower reserves, but the dominant culture remained fixated on the decisive offensive blow.
And leading up to 1914, the German army itself got much bigger. Worries about Russia.
Yes, there was a significant expansion. Moltke the Younger, who was chief of the general staff then, really pushed for bigger numbers. He saw the growing potential for a major European war and felt Germany had to be ready.
So the years just before the war. The book describes the atmosphere as tense, unstable, a kind of stable crisis.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. A palpable sense of unease. A feeling, especially among nationalist groups and parts of the military, that conflict was almost inevitable, maybe even desirable, to assert Germany's position.
And in Sarajevo, June 1914. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand acts as the spark. The July crisis follows, and boom, Europe's at war. The book stresses Germany's role in that escalation.
Critically important, Germany's blank check to Austria-Hungary, the promise of unconditional support, was crucial in encouraging Austria to take a hard line against Serbia.
Escalating things dramatically.
Yes, and Moltke's assurances to Austria, apparently made without full coordination with the civilian government, really show how much influence the military had at that crucial moment.
When war breaks out in August 1914, there's this initial wave of unity in Germany, the August Days.
Initially, yes. Widespread enthusiasm, patriotic fervor. Many people across different classes seemed united, believing it would be a short, victorious war. Those existing social and political divisions seemed to melt away temporarily.
Temporarily being the key word. The book quickly moves to the harsh reality of a long, brutal war. The Schlieffen Plan. It didn't work.
It failed. The initial German offensive stalled. Why? Logistics were a nightmare supplying and coordinating those massive armies on the move. Plus, Belgian resistance was stronger than expected, the French fought back hard, communications broke down, no quick victory in the West.
And the war drags on. The book mentions unrestricted submarine warfare as a later desperate measure. What came of that?
The U-boat campaign caused havoc for Allied shipping initially, but it didn't deliver a knockout blow, its biggest consequence. It was the final straw that brought the United States into the war in 1917.
Bringing in massive American resources.
Exactly, tipping the long-term balance decisively against Germany.
And the final German push in spring 1918. That also failed.
Ludendorff's spring offensives made some big tactical gains initially, broke through the lines in places, but they couldn't sustain it. The Allies, reinforced by the Americans, had superior resources, more manpower. The German army was exhausted. It led to the final retreat.
Throughout the war section, the book keeps coming back to total war. The idea that the home front was just as important as the battlefront. Civilians were deeply involved, suffering immensely.
Absolutely. The war devastated the German economy and society. The British naval blockade caused severe food shortages, the infamous turnip winter. The government imposed tight controls on everything, rationing. The home front was completely mobilized and endured incredible hardship.
And women's roles. The book notes they entered the workforce in huge numbers.
Yes, taking jobs left by men fighting at the front. Essential contributions in factories, transport, agriculture, but often facing lower pay, difficult conditions.
Was it seen as a permanent shift?
Generally, no. These new roles were mostly seen as temporary for the duration of the war. The expectation was that traditional gender roles would return afterwards. The social reality on the home front was tough, marked by inequality, especially for working-class families.
And that initial unity, the August Days,
Mm-hmm.
did it last? Or did the old divisions come back?
They definitely came back and intensified. The immense strain of the long war worsened social tensions. Resentment grew between classes, between soldiers at the front and those perceived to have safer jobs, towards war profiteers. And anti-Semitism also flared up, fueled by wartime anxieties and scapegoating.
What about Germany's goals in the war? The book says they were pretty ambitious, aiming for dominance in Europe.
Very ambitious. The leadership envisioned a post-war Europe dominated by Germany, involving annexing territory, creating puppet states. The September program laid some of this out early on.
But how did that square with what was actually happening in occupied areas?
It often clashed dramatically. Military occupation was harsh. Local populations resisted, had their own national aspirations. German war aims were far removed from the realities on the ground.
As defeat looms in late 1918, were there calls for peace? Did the leadership listen?
Yes, war weariness was immense. There were strikes, growing calls for a negotiated end. But the military high command, especially Ludendorff, clung to the hope of somehow achieving a better outcome through military means for a surprisingly long time.
Until they couldn't anymore.
Until the military situation completely collapsed in the autumn of 1918. Then, realizing defeat was unavoidable, the military leadership did a surprising thing.
Who was that?
They actually pushed for the creation of a new civilian government based on the Reichstag majority parties, specifically to request the armistice.
Handing off the responsibility.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Shifting the burden of surrender onto the politicians, which would later fuel the stab-in-the-back myth.
And that leads to the end of the empire, the revolution, the Weimar Republic. The book concludes by reflecting on the empire's legacy, right? And interestingly, it challenges the idea of a straight line from the empire to Nazism.
Yes, that's a really key part of Chickering's argument. He pushes back against the Sonderweg idea, the notion that Germany followed some uniquely flawed path directly to Nazism.
He sees it differently.
He argues that Imperial Germany's history was, in many ways, a normal history common to Europe. With its own specific tensions and characteristics, yes, but not necessarily predetermined to end in catastrophe. He emphasizes contingency.
So not inevitable.
He suggests the truly extreme pathologies of the 20th century weren't solely baked into the empire itself, but were profoundly shaped by the trauma of World War I and then the crises of the Weimar Republic that followed. The war is critical.
Okay. So we've traced quite a path there, following Chickering's book chronologically, from unification, the struggles of building a nation, through that massive industrial boom.
The social conflicts, the political fights, the rise of nationalism and militarism.
Right, the push for world power, and then tumbling into World War I and the empire's collapse.
And hopefully it's clear how interconnected all these things were. Social changes fueling political movements, economic pressures shaping foreign policy, cultural ideas influencing military strategy. It's all woven together.
Definitely. Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, our listeners. Chickering constantly compares Imperial Germany to other nations. So thinking about that, how might understanding the dynamics of this specific period, the challenges, the divisions, the way they tried to build a nation, how might that offer insights for us today, thinking about nation building, managing deep societal divisions in our own time?
And building on that, the author suggests Imperial Germany's history was, in many ways, normal, common to Europe. Does exploring this history through our deep dive today, does it challenge your own assumptions about national identity, about historical paths seeming inevitable? Or maybe it confirms some things for you.
Lots to think about. As always, this is just the start of the conversation.